Welcome to the Managing Violence podcast, helping to make communities safer by providing education in how to prevent, prepare, respond, and recover from violence in all its forms. Your host is an expert in violence and aggression management. Here is Joe Saunders.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Managing Violence podcast. We're going to dive straight in today. My guest today is Doug Melia from the UK. Doug is a physical restraint and physical intervention specialist. He has a product of soft restraints, which he'll explain what that is. But he specializes in the harm reduction in restraining patients or subjects in healthcare, corrections, education, and all other contexts as well. It's a topic that doesn't get as much airtime as it deserves because realistically, restraining people is one of the most difficult things that we do in the managing violence sphere. And it also has an incredible amount of risk, not just for the officer, but also for the subject. And being able to safely restrain somebody with a minimum of harm and stress is critically important for risk reduction in a variety of sectors. So this is an important conversation to have, and I'm very grateful for Doug making himself available while he was actually in Australia here, not the same place as me, but in the same country at least, so we're in the same time zone, and we could have this conversation at a mutually agreeable hour. But look, without further ado, I'm going to throw straight to Doug Melia. Thanks for joining me, Doug. It's great to have you here on the Managing Violence podcast. As I was mentioning to you before we started recording, Jim Snipe from season 1 recommended you as a guest a long time ago, over a year ago before I even started the podcast. He said you're a man I should talk to. So I'm glad we finally managed to make it happen.
No, that's great. It's good to be here in Australia as well. Despite the weather conditions we've got in Sydney, it's great to be here again.
Yeah, well, did I just hear a POM complain about the weather in Australia?
Standard, yeah.
Yeah, at least London isn't on fire at the moment, or the UK isn't on fire at the moment. So, yeah, there is that. Doug, for those of you that don't know anything about you, can you take us for a couple of minutes and just sort of walk us through your background, who you are, what you do, and how you got there?
Of course I can. Yeah, you mentioned Jim. Jim's a good friend of mine. He comes over to the UK multiple times a year. I've seen him speak about his experiences, and he's come to qualify as a soft restraint trainer with ourselves. So our business provides soft restraint equipment, soft restraint belts, cuffs, and safe holding systems internationally. And I kind of fell into this industry from starting as a martial arts teacher. I was taken to martial arts classes as a kid by my mum. Cried, didn't like it, but she left me, and it was the best favour she ever did for me. Went into training of security people. Back in the year 2000 in the UK, I'm not sure if you're aware, but we passed the Private Security Act, and overnight we had 10,000 security people lose their jobs because we put criminal record checks in place. So, I mean, that tells you a couple of things. It tells you about the state of the industry and who it was being run by, but it also gave us an element of regulation. So I became a trainer, training security guards, did a lot of work across the NHS hospitals, and then I sort of cut the cord on that and went to do some work as a bodyguard, signed a non-compete to sell my business, and off I went. And as with bodyguard work, it can be sporadic. I ended up falling into high court enforcement, and I saw that the removal of protesters was a fairly unregulated industry, and we had to look for these other options and other avenues, and that's where we fell into doing the soft restraint equipment, mainly because we had the media watching us, and we had a lot of the police with us. Said, look, you're the Queen's bailiffs, you're the ones that are qualified to do this, we're going to stand back and watch you do it. And it was quite a sensitive job, and through that, it's not a career path you could plan, but here I am.
Yeah, actually, for those that aren't familiar with the terminology, can you sort of just quickly define what a soft restraint is?
Yeah, so it's sometimes you would refer to it as mechanical, but we try and avoid that term because it immediately conjures up your metal leg restraints and your handcuffs and your shackles and things like that. Soft restraints are made of tough Cordura fabric. They've got Omni Velcro on them, which makes them stronger in both directions. The buckles on them are made of a reinforced nylon with the same melting temperature as glass. And the idea is they act instead of prolonged manual holds. They aid to get people out of dangerous positions such as prone, and when used as a modular kit altogether, they can actually be used to lift and carry people. So they fit in with a whole host of international regulations and workplace regulations, not just to do with reducing restraint and the times of restraint, but also for a manual handling aid. If you consider any other manual handling activity, we would automate it. So in the supermarket, your shopping isn't passed to you; it comes down a conveyor belt. In a hospital, somebody's moved in a wheelchair. In a warehouse, forklift trucks lift people. It's an way of automating or mechanizing the actual activity of holding someone.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And look, I similar background to you. I mean, I started off as a martial artist, and then I started working indoors while I was at university, and it was an eye opener for me when you go from choreographed violence or simulated violence to real violence, and then I quickly realized that I think control and restraint is probably the hardest skill set to learn when it comes to physical combat, because not only are you trying to protect your own safety, but you're also trying to protect the safety of the person who's trying to harm you, and that
That's right.
is incredibly difficult because you're operating within parameters that they aren't, and they're not concerned about your safety in the slightest. So, so you're actually trying to protect someone who has no concern about your protection, while at the same time trying to keep yourself safe and accomplish some sort of goal, whether it's a removal or restraint or arrest or whatever it might be. So, I think it's definitely a topic that it doesn't get as much attention as it deserves, because it's very easy for us to be critical when it goes wrong, when we have officers or security guards or crowd controllers or whatever using excessive force, but we don't really spend a lot of time appreciating just how difficult that can be. And for me, it was an eye-opener working there. And then when I moved into healthcare, now you've got a whole bunch of other sensitivities, and you've got a lot of other factors in terms of medical risk and the fact the person is a patient, they're not an offender. That changes things again.
Yeah, it does, absolutely. Where you've got, in the UK, we call it's Section 3 of the Health and Safety at Work Act, is to do with duty of care to others. So, okay, that could be protecting that people out there, the general public, from a patient you're looking after, but the others are the patients. They're the patients, they're the inmates, they're the prisoners, they're the people we have to look after. And it's interesting to mention healthcare, because sometimes when you compare policing to healthcare, the policing can be very much them and us. And some countries are criticised heavily for this, where it's the good guys and the bad guys. Whereas in healthcare, it's the opposite way around. But what differentiates that person from being a violent offender to being a patient? It's not like we live in a Lego world where you've got the criminals there and the patients there and then the school children there. And they're all people, and we need to make sure that we manage them for their own safety, but also for staff safety. And I think it's a fine line sometimes that's often toppled.
Yeah, absolutely, and it crosses over so frequently. I remember as a young security guard working in a hospital, being a little bit befuddled when the police would bring someone in handcuffs that had just been involved in a violent incident. They've assaulted police, and they're now in handcuffs, and they bring them to the hospital, take the handcuffs off, and go, "Okay, he's yours now." And
that's right.
so now he's a patient, and before that he was an offender that was he probably already got half a flogging on his way to the hospital. So it's quite interesting that transition of custody and the change in duty of care. And I always said when I was teaching in healthcare aggression that you're really trying to satisfy three masters. You're trying to keep your staff safe, you're trying to keep your patients safe, and you're also trying to keep the reputation of the organization or the hospital safe. And what you teach has to satisfy all three of those things.
Yeah, it does. And it's very easy sometimes for your consultants in their ivory towers to say, we don't like the thought of soft restraints, or isn't this a step backwards? But they're not the ones, like you say, having the offenders handed over to them in handcuffs to say, okay, our piece of paper now says they're no longer a criminal, they're no longer a danger, they are going to be a patient, and you're going to treat them. But that treatment plan has still got to take into consideration the risks that weighed against the staff and then weighed against the patient themselves.
Yeah, and I think part of that, historically, at least here in Australia, is that we've been very keen to place charges when or to make complaints when a patient has been mistreated, but there was for years a culture of staff just sucking it up and accepting the fact that being assaulted was part of their job. So
it's part of your job.
Yeah.
You've got to accept it. It's the way it is. I've heard that before.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we ended up weighting that reputational damage to the organisation above the safety of our staff, and I think that is it's a massive issue that we're still fighting through now, even though things are changing. With we talked about offline with the workplace manslaughter laws that are coming out, or in some states already active. So I think there's a change happening there, but it will be cultural and it will probably be generational.
I think so, yeah. I mean, in the UK, we're in the middle of an election today. Today's voting day. I've cast my vote postally. I won't say who I've voted for, but there's a lot of pressure on us to leave Europe, and there's talk about the Human Rights Act, and it always makes me laugh because a lot of the politicians talk about us leaving human rights behind. Well, in 1998, we passed our own Human Rights Act, and I know Australia have just done similar, so that the law's already there. And the fundamentals of human rights, really, it doesn't matter which country you're in, the fundamentals are the same. It's about protecting life and reducing risk. It's about prohibiting torture. We want to try and reduce what is the definition of torture, or pain and suffering, which goes on for a prolonged period of time, or it can even be inhumane and degrading treatment. And the other inherent human right is more about the freedom of thought and the freedom of religious belief and things like that. So sometimes people can bang on about human rights and they're talking about things like liberty, or they're talking about a right to education. If you take schools, for example, you can't educate a pupil who's harming themselves, assaulting others, or abusing other people. And that's why we see things as education and liberty as qualified rights. So people have to qualify for them when we've got the safety side of things right. But from my point of view, with the soft restraint kit, by enabling staff to hold somebody in a less intrusive way and a less invasive way in many cases, it can reduce that degrading treatment and the risks to life that comes with prolonged manual restraint through struggling and exhaustion and all the other things such as positional asphyxia.
Yeah, actually, that's probably a good segue. I think for our listeners are spread across a variety of demographics. We have some that are just interested in their own personal safety. We have some that work in law enforcement and healthcare and corrections that may have some exposure. But would you like to just sort of set the scene about how restraint works, and I guess what the risks of restraint are, whether it's prolonged restraint or positional concerns and so on? Just sort of set the scene about where soft restraints come in and what the benefits might be.
Yeah, of course. So positional asphyxia for some people is a little bit like global warming. They don't want to admit that they don't want to admit it works. They've got their own skewed reports and analyses and things like that. Certain positions are often demonized. But positional asphyxia occurs when pressure, or often where pressure or weight is applied, or a person's body is put in a certain position, which affects their airway, lung function, or diaphragmatic function. So if you think, common sense would tell you, okay, bending somebody forwards, placing somebody on their front who's got a bit of a belly on them is going to make the diaphragm ineffective, so the stomach contents press on it. The things like prolonged struggling. There's also genetic risks such as sickle cell anemia. You've got obesity, add to that use of alcohol and drugs. So when you're holding somebody, people can look at that grip and they can say, there's a window of opportunity here. If I create a lull or create a diversion or a distraction, I can probably break free. And that's often where you get this prolonged struggling and fighting against the holds. Staff are obviously fearing for their lives, so their complex, moderate motor skills go out the window, and they're just relying on those large muscle groups pushing or applying weight to the body. And with a sort of a pack mentality, you can have 2, 3, 4 people literally piling on top of people and trying to hold them to the floor. So the soft restraints, in a situation like that, you could bring soft restraints much the same way as you would handcuffs, to end the situation, to gain control of the person quickly, and then keep them get them into a seated position or get them out of that prone position onto their side. or it might be they're used preemptively. So we use the soft restraint kits, or the safe holding system, we call it, in intensive care units, where people have previously been woken up from sedation and they've been combative. So they've said, right, we're going to try and wake this person up again. We're going to try and get the cocktail of drugs correct this time so that they don't fight. Is everybody ready to restrain them? Well, this person wakes up, the first thing they do is they rip tubes out, they rip arterial lines out, they sometimes crocodile roll off the bed, ripping catheters out, and expensive machinery is pulled over. By applying a few simple restraint belts and soft cuffs to somebody, it puts handles on the body so they can hold them whilst they bring them round. If they are combative, put them back to sleep, or if they appear to be calm, then they can gradually relax the restraints. So they can be used modularly, basically to restrict certain limbs on the body, to mean that staff can actually control them. Because, I mean, you've come across it before, Joe. Some people you've dealt with, I'm sure you could say, no, we wouldn't be able to restrain them, either because of what they've taken or their strength or how they present.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you mentioned throwing in a cocktail of drugs and alcohol, because it complicates things so much. Because their endurance may be off the charts. they may not fatigue at the same rate you're fatiguing trying to control them, and then but then again they may also completely crash, and you may have they'd have a medical issue to deal with. And look, I was involved in many prolonged restraints that I look back on in hindsight, and just very thankful they didn't go pear-shaped when they could have. In fact, in my bouncing days, we had an incident at a hotel where, so we basically, my company was looking after two hotels about 400 meters apart, and basically shared the same patronage. We occasionally worked both venues, and there was a restraint-related death. Well, so there was a death at one of the venues that I was working at the opposite venue, and three of the crowd controllers were charged with murder as a result of the death, and the allegation was that they had their restraint had led to his death. That they'd applied a chokehold that essentially strangled him to death, and then left him while they're waiting for police to attend. And that was the allegation. It took 4 years for it to go through the courts, and all three were eventually acquitted, because the subject had variety of drugs and alcohol and congenital heart issues and so on, and basically there's inconclusive evidence that their actions, their actions had actually caused his death. But the thing that spooked me at the time, and I was fairly new in the industry, only been in about a year and a half, and the position that they had restrained him in was the position we all use, which was face down, so prone, hands behind the back, legs crossed in a figure four, and someone had his head turned, and they had pressure on the back of his head to keep him from banging his head into the ground. And that was what we all used while we're waiting for the police. And sometimes that was 10 minutes, sometimes it was 15 minutes. Hopefully it wasn't longer than that, but occasionally it was. And he was, I think he was about 5'10", about 130 kilos. So he was quite a large lad. You look back with the benefit of acquired knowledge, and you think, man, that was a recipe for disaster. But again, they were doing what we all did at the time, and they did it with the best of faith that they were doing the right thing.
That's right. Yeah, and it's what you see on the TV. It's what you see on the news. It's what you see on the TV. It's what's in general media, on the movies. It's all okay. The person's dangerous. Let's get them to the floor. Let's hold them on the floor. So, aside from the soft restraints, there's also other devices out there. There's a device called the safety pod, which is a specifically designed giant beanbag I've come across, which is used widely in the UK. And I know it's touring Oz in January next year, Brisbane, Tasmania, Sydney. And that gives an alternative for staff to hold people. So in custody suites in the UK, they've been piloted. And instead of everybody piling on and putting somebody on the floor, it's a case of getting somebody sat in something or holding somebody down. Now, the prone position, the face down position, it is demonized quite a lot. And the only thing I'd say in defense of prone is I sleep in the prone position every night, and I've not died once. So as far as that's a good point. It's true. I've done my own scientific research. As far as the actual prone position goes, there are so many other factors that work with that. And I know in the UK we had an issue where some people thought that prone was banned. And I know in Australia that there was some recommendations, perhaps by the chief psychiatrist, to say, oh, don't hold somebody in prone for any longer than 2 minutes, or maybe it was 3 minutes. And all of this is so subjective, and it depends on so many other factors, like you say, alcohol, drugs, obesity. And if you've got somebody who's suffered previous abuse, they are not going to want to be held on their back, pinned down by 4 guys. So they might actually choose to lie in the prone position. But I think overall, an education about where pressure and weight shouldn't be applied, how people are held, and also not this immediate knee-jerk reaction to say, oh, we don't want to use devices to restrain people. They're dangerous. Now, the way we train is we always have 2 absolutes. And the first absolute is to put any kind of mechanical, soft restraint, handcuff device on somebody, you've got to have control of them first. So you've either have to have effective holds where staff then transition into using the kit, or the person's got to be sedated, the example of the ICUs, or you've got compliance. Now, we've got countless case studies where patients choose to wear the soft restraints because it allows them to take part in other activities. If you've got somebody who's become this mythical monster because of newspaper articles and staff assaults previously, and you've got them in a room in a forensic hospital, and staff are saying, we've got a risk assessment here that says somebody's going to get bitten, somebody's going to get attacked, they're going to make a suicide attempt, and then they're going to end up staying there in that room. And in the UK, we have these assessment treatment units, we call them, which is just a nice word for locking people up. And we've got people that have been in them for 2 years. And we're not just talking about adults here or criminals. We're talking about some children, adolescents, that the risk assessments dictated it's too dangerous for them. And they end up being kept in a room, fed through a hatch, and they can only have any human contact through speaking through intercoms. Now, that to me is ludicrous. And if you did that with a dog, you would get sent to prison. You'd get locked up for it because it's against the law. So by saying to these people, look, you want to come out of this room, we want to get you out of this room, we're going to let you wear this device, which restricts your arm movements. You're still going to be able to sit. You're going to be able to play Xbox, PlayStation. You can maybe do some gardening supervised. That's then baby steps to start getting them integrated with others. So we've got, obviously, the soft restraints and things can be used for the sharp end of the spectrum, where people are at risk of dying within a matter of minutes, but they can also be used as a tool to get people engaged in meaningful activities. And let's face it, we do want to rehabilitate these people and get them back into society.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a fantastic point you just raised about it actually improves quality of treatment and quality of life, really, for inpatients, because as you say, it allows them to participate in things that otherwise the risk would be too high. And look, I keep coming back to staff safety as well, because it was a major, it was the bane of my existence while I was working in healthcare, was the lack of concern for staff safety, and I think the demonization of restraints, of using any sort of what we call mechanical restraint, led to issues. I remember very distinctly, we had one incident where a 15-year-old was brought in by police. And the short version is both his parents had been arrested for a domestic, quite a nasty domestic situation. And as the parents were being taken away, the kid attacked police. So the kid had been arrested and needed medical treatment, but he also had no guardians who were able to be with him. So we've now got a 15-year-old who's incredibly angry and strong, and a fairly large kid. And he needs to be restrained, but we know we don't actually have any guardian who can authorize any sort of medical action. So obviously no one's going to give him a chemical restraint, and no one was prepared to authorize any sort of mechanical restraint. So we were physically holding this kid down for 4 hours. 4 hours.
Wow.
We had to have rotating teams basically restraining limbs because he just wouldn't stop fighting. And I look at the risk to him, but also to our staff. I mean, we were fatigued, we were cramping, we're on a non-height adjustable bed, so we're
Yeah.
bent over, trying to pin him down and try to de-escalate as best we can. But if we'd had access to some modern soft restraints and someone's prepared to authorize the usage, that whole situation could have been resolved so much easier, because after a certain point, he was only angry because we were restraining him. But if we let him go, the risk was too high. So what do you do?
Exactly. Yeah, and I mean, we try and follow a health and safety model where we can, which we call ERIC PD, which is eliminate, reduce, isolate, control, PPE, and discipline. So if you consider the control element is holding someone, you can either move back or you can move forward. So to move back from control would be say, right, we're going to disengage, we're going to leave the room, we're going to contain the person. But when that's a vulnerable 15-year-old who's possibly at risk of harming themselves, you can't dictate that. So that's why you end up holding someone for 4 hours. The other alternative would be to move forward and consider that use of work equipment to use some form of soft restraint. Now, in the UK, because of things that happened in the past and because of Bethlehem Hospital, which was known as Bedlam, where literally people would go down and they'd watch the people with mental health problems as some kind of show, like an ancient Jeremy Kyle or Jerry Springer kind of show, Maury or something like that. We've said, right, no more of this stuff. Let's get rid of it. And the old style straitjackets and bed restraints have been thrown out. And within our mental health code of practice, it almost forbids people being tied or tethered to objects. So in the UK, I'm saying to people, this kind of stuff could do this, it could do that. Overseas, I'm sometimes scaling things back. So people want to know why our kit doesn't fix people or fasten people to beds. And we always come back with the same reason as well. We don't want you to leave people unattended. Number one, you've got to have control of people. And number two, once you've got the people in the fixed soft restraints or mechanical restraints, you need to keep an eye on them so that you can check the vital signs and so you can hopefully start to remove some of them to de-escalate. But I do see in some places the practice of fixing people or fastening people to beds is there simply because it's easier. And then you've got less staff keeping an eye on them for if they are combative.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's not leaving people unattended. I think was, as you say, there's a massive stigma against securing people to objects, and there's a variety of good reasons for that. But I think the natural human element when you've got people that are rushed off their feet trying to look after multiple patients and competing priorities is, well, that person's restrained to the bed now. I can walk away. I can go do something else and come back and check on them. That's not great.
Yeah. And from management's point of view, it's cheaper. It's like, oh, look, we've got one person in charge of 6-7 people. Great.
Yeah, we'll just tie down everybody. Why not?
Well, yeah. on that thread, in certain European countries, I won't mention which, I've come across bed cages. So you've got a ward full of people, and each bed is in effect a small cage which those people exist in. So that's a really, in my eyes, it's a really harsh form of it. And one of the things I always stipulate before we start teaching people how to use this kit is, number one, I want to see evidence that you've got some form of violence prevention. I know that's what you guys specialize in. So they've got some kind of de-escalation. People have been given some tools and skills to recognize, diffuse, de-escalate, and avoid if possible. They also need to have a physical skills package. So they need to know how to restrain people. And only then would we then sanction the use of the restraints, because that's how we can protect from them being abused.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that we stress, and no matter what innovations we come up with, there's no such thing as a perfectly safe physical restraint, because there's so many variables on the patient end, on the staff end, on the environmental side that could potentially cause issues. That restraint should be avoided if at all possible. But when it is the option, it's sometimes the only option. So we have to have methods in place that reduce or mitigate that risk as much as we possibly can. But we also need to have a heavy emphasis on trying to avoid being in that situation in the first place. So I fully agree.
That's right. So I'm over in Sydney at the moment. I've just been doing a bit of a tour. We're doing some training in Brisbane, updating some new trainers there. We had the pleasure of going up to Townsville and working with some excellent staff there. And I managed to get a few days off in Magnetic Island, which was out of this world. But the reason I'm back in Sydney is because it's part of a 3-year program we've been running in implementing soft restraints in the forensic hospital here. Now, there's an inquest report come out with a death which was quite high profile in Australia for a man called David Dungey. Now, David Dungey, all you have to do is Google it and you'll find out lots of information around this death and how it happened. There's even a harrowing video showing his last moments. And it was the prolonged restraint and the positions that staff held him that were all factors in this. But the inquest, which came out literally a few weeks ago, highlighted that to try and avoid further deaths like this, they're going to look into the use of soft restraints. And they mention our soft restraint kit and how they're being used in the forensic hospital. And this is something that's echoed in every country we work in, that it shouldn't be a sector by sector issue. It should be a cross-sector issue. So we should be talking about deaths during restraint, period. We shouldn't be talking about deaths in this community. We shouldn't be talking about deaths in policing or immigration. It's the same thing. You're still holding the same human form. And let's face it, a human being is a bundle of volatile chemicals waiting to be shaken the wrong way and erupt anyway. It doesn't matter if they're in a school, prison cell, or a bedroom. The issues are still the same.
Yeah, actually, let's have a bit of a chat about that case. The David Dungey inquest, as you said, the report just came out, and you actually jogged my memory about it when you mentioned it. So what were your sort of observations about how that was handled and how it, whether there was areas you think could have been done better, or was it just a lack of resourcing?
I think it's a training issue more than anything. We've had similar deaths in the UK within custody, and there's always a public outcry because the public, they want their pound of flesh. They want somebody, a face, they want a name that they can hold accountable for this. And when officers are exonerated from killing somebody, there's outrageous outcry, and sometimes those officers will never work again. And if they do work again, they're going to be sat behind the desk pushing a pen because of the operational risk of putting them back in their positions where they are. But for me, it's a little bit deeper than that. It should be going back to and that's exactly what's happening now as it unfolds. It's going back to a training issue, and they want to be looking at the legal, medical, and tactical issues around it, not the actions of a group of people who really are doing as they've been told. They're managing a really extreme situation. Possibly they've not had the correct training around positional asphyxia or around the risks to certain risk factors, or even the question that I know in the David Dungey case that arose was, did it have to get to that level in the first place? Did it need to escalate? Was it merely people trying to enforce instructions? And if we can go back to that original de-escalation and management of things and say to staff, look, with some incidents of this nature, they are going to get out of hand, and we have had people die. Maybe we should identify what we're trying to enforce and the reasons for getting involved in lengthy restraints in the first place.
Yeah, it's interesting. When we talk about introducing restraint, really the conversation around restraint, let alone the products around restraint, to a variety of sectors. Have you found that there's a difference in how receptive, say, corrections or the justice system is versus healthcare and other areas?
Yes, I have. Yeah, I tend to find that some sectors are trailblazing, and then I tend to find that other sectors are just saying, this is the way we've always done it, let's keep doing it this way. And that's got to be the most dangerous statement in the human language. We've always done it this way, let's keep doing it this way. So one thing I did want to talk about with you today was something about the Nuremberg Principle. So in the actions there where we've got those guys that have restrained David Dungey and then they've been exonerated, and we've had similar things in the UK with UK police. Just to give you an idea, from 1990 until present day, we've had 1,072 deaths in police custody, and we've had 0 convictions of police officers. Now that in itself tells us that there's something wrong. It doesn't immediately smack of police corruption because, let's face it, by the time the police get there and do police stuff, which often involves prone, cuffing people, taser, use of firearms and incapacitant sprays and batons, the person's already probably been under the influence of some drugs. There's been a prolonged manual restraint, and then there's been often other injuries which can contribute to things like airways clothing, or impact on the ribs could impact on the lungs and things like that. But if you've got people that have been given training that's incorrect, that's where this kind of goes out of the window a little bit. To give you an example, there was a case that a friend of mine was involved with in the UK where they'd been asked to do a single person restraint. Now, I won't get on my soapbox about single person restraint, but unless they happen instinctively and reactively, it's something that we should be avoiding. The person that he was restraining was injured, and there was a civil court case launched. So his argument was, look, I did this single person restraint because I was told it was safe. Here's my manual. I was told by the trainer to do it. Now, across different sectors, unless it's policing, unless it's immigration, unless it's the prison service or custodial or corrections, often it's an unregulated industry. So you've got people who are out there just teaching what they think is right. So a martial arts teacher might involve takedowns, he might involve strikes. Someone who's an Aikido practitioner might say, yeah, we'll use this wrist lock, or we'll use that wrist lock. Because it's unregulated, it comes back to people carrying out instructions given by somebody else. So they refer to it as the Nuremberg Principle, because that's what happened in Nazi Germany. People said, oh, hang on, this was my job. Yeah, but your job was to do something unethical and illegal that resulted in people's deaths. You can't claim that. So this is important for me, that people that are carrying out restraint should look across different sectors, and they should scrutinize what they're being taught. First of all, they should check the people teaching them are qualified and it's consistent with what they're being shown. Well, back to your original question, because I've gone off on a tangent. I tend to find healthcare.
That's why, mate. This show's all about the tangents. That's where the best stuff happens.
Excellent. The healthcare side of things, it tends to be quite fluffy, or the term I've heard used in courts is politically expedient. So we take certain things out because people don't like them. Oh, I don't like the thought of a knee strike to the peroneal nerve on the side of the thigh. I don't like the thought of whacking an attacker in the groin. We don't like the thought of a finger and thumb restraint bending somebody's arm up against the back. But it's all got to be about context. And if we start taking away these vital techniques or these important techniques and replacing them with wishy-washy, watered-down strategies, number one, it's going to increase the unnecessary use of mechanical restraint. Now, there's an argument for and against that, because I would always say, instead of having to use pain with someone, if you can use a soft restraint to enable them to calm down, for some examples, the example you gave with the 15-year-old would be ideal, because if he's not stopped struggling after 1 hour or 2 hours or 3 hours, he's probably going to carry on struggling into the 4th hour. So that's an idea where we could say, yeah, let's avoid the pain side of things. So healthcare tends to be a little bit watered down and wishy-washy. Then on the policing side of things, because of the mainstream media tells us all about terrorists and it's sometimes mental health issues where somebody's appeared at a shopping centre with a knife can be dressed up as, oh, it's international security and it's integral. We all get very patriotic about it. So we can then start saying, yeah, let's arm the police. Let's arm the police with more measures, and let's have this shoot to kill policy, or let's have this higher level of force. So each sector, depending on what's in the media, can be heavily influenced. And that's why it's got to be a cross-sector discussion, because if it's not a cross-sector discussion, we get that cognitive bias. We get that bias where it's led by the emotions or the experiences that people have had. And in the UK, we've had the rise of what we call experts by experience, which are, and I think there's definitely a place for them, which are people who've been in forensic hospitals, or they've been arrested by the police, or they've perhaps been abused in children's homes, and they're now having their voices heard. So they're getting to say, this is how I felt when I was restrained, or this is what happened to me, or this is how I felt when my daughter was locked in an assessment unit. And I think it's great that we hear these people's voices, but just because I get hit by a car in the road doesn't make me an expert on traffic safety, doesn't make me an expert on traffic measures. So we've got to put it in its right place and say, yeah, we're going to listen to your opinion and your view. Well, we've got to accept there's a cognitive bias from you because you've experienced these things, and we've got to compare that against the risks to the staff who are actually having to carry out the restraints.
Yeah, and I think the golden word you mentioned there was context. It's so easy to pull apart what happened or the impact and look at techniques in a sterile courtroom environment and say, well, that looks really bad. You shouldn't have done that, without the context of someone's making a split-second decision to try and protect themselves or to try and control a situation as best as possible. Often while they're well aware they're being filmed, and you've got people heckling them, and you've got all these other factors. And you take away that context, and it's very easy to be the armchair quarterback who says, well, I would have done that differently. I have this conversation with so many guests, and we all agree that anyone who starts a comment on social media with "I would have" probably hasn't been there. So you know that if you're confident enough to say what you would have done, then you're definitely part of that Dunning-Kruger effect. So it's interesting, and just from a context point of view. With the package that was being taught when I went into healthcare, for very high-end situations, we're still teaching. I think it was referred to as a vascular neck restraint, which is basically a rear naked choke or a sleeper hold. And that was being taught with the context of very, very, very high end. Like we're out of options. None of our security at that time had any tools. We had no handcuffs, no batons. We're literally just completely unarmed. So in a situation where it was starting to get towards life and death, it's not a bad option to have. But when it's used out of context, and it eventually got removed from the program because a gung-ho security officer choked out a 17-year-old in front of his parents. Right. that was very hard to defend, and unfortunately, what's held responsible there is he shouldn't have been trained to do it, and that technique is unlawful, and that technique looks horrible, and the parents thought he was killing their child, and therefore we lose the technique, and the training suffers, as opposed to the security guard took it well out of context.
Yeah, well, the vascular hold or the neck hold you speak of is very contentious anyway, because it goes back to the Rodney King case, which sparked massive Watts riots. So the reason that the officers gave for their justification in the case for beating Rodney King with the batons, which was all caught on film, was because they weren't allowed to use on that ethnic group a vascular restraint because they've been so criticized for it in the past. So it's an example there of taking away skills that could be used in context to save people's lives. That could have ended. I mean, who'd have known? I mean, it could be a case of police brutality. I don't want to get into the political side of things, but had that vascular restraint been there, it could have certainly been an option. And we're seeing that within healthcare, where people are having these strategies taken away. And within the training context of a dojo or a training room, we might be able to take through transitioning from one arm hold to another. We might even be able to do breakaway holds that allow us to use a lower level of force. But in an emergency, if people think they're not allowed to strike to vital areas of the body, or they're not allowed to use it, for a martial artist, that vascular restraint might be quick, it might be effective for them to use. But if that's taken away from them, what do they do? People panic, people revert to type, and they end up struggling and fighting with someone. And I've heard people say, I don't believe in that. If you don't believe in it, all you need to do is go and watch one of these police reality programs, Cops with Cameras and Road Wars, we call them in the UK, and I love watching some of the US and Australian ones. And you'll see these police officers who are very, very well trained, and in that state of high emotional anxiety, what are they doing? They're doing whatever comes into their mind. They're getting people in headlocks, they're struggling, they're fighting, and it's because they've lost control, and they're saying, look, I just need to do something to gain control of this person. And if we take away vital strategies from people that are in healthcare or in other community settings, or even, like you say, in bouncing or security positions, we might get back to that panic. We've just had an incident happen at Winter Wonderland in the UK, which is a theme park which sets up in Hyde Park with multiple security fighting. There's a lot of people saying, the training's not there. I think the base level training that they're given is too little. It's all we're shown in the UK as security guards is to guide people and hold them, and the guidance actually says with their consent. Now, I don't know about you, Joe, but I've never restrained anyone with their consent.
It's
It's
very
often the
unlikely.
opposite. Yeah,
Exactly.
it's often the opposite. So aside from it being a hand-holding course, which shows us how to guide someone, people do need further training. And that's where the misconception of smoke and mirrors comes in, where people think, oh, this is what I got shown in my course. That's all I'm allowed to do. Well, no, get some specialist training in there. Look at the risks you're facing and say, okay, yeah, if I work at Lord's Cricket Ground and I'm dealing with elderly people or proms on the park, yeah, I might just need to escort someone or guide someone who's a bit drunk or who's a bit tired. But if you're at the high end of the security market, where it's shown that we're having to hold people on the ground, sometimes where police response times are poor for long periods of time, then extra training and the sourcing of extra equipment, for example, might be required.
Yeah, and unfortunately, a couple of hours of training at the licensing level and then nothing that follows up is unlikely to pay any dividends a couple of years down the track. By then, you've already picked up whatever habits you're going to have, and you're going to be doing whatever techniques come instinctively to you at that point. And we even see that with policing. And unless you're at a specialist unit, you get very limited refresher training when it comes to restraint and arrest and self-defense, and therefore officers kind of take it upon themselves to train in whatever they're going to train in. And look, if you're training 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 hours a week in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, you're more likely to do that than you are to do the 4 hours of onboarding training you got in the academy. It's just unrealistic to expect otherwise. If we're not going to train people, they're not going to act in accordance with that training. So
no,
anyway,
they're not at all.
It's another soapbox.
Yeah, so just before we wrap up, you touched on refresher training, which is really interesting, because I've asked this of so many different people, and I've asked it of so many legal professionals and medical professionals about how often people should update or refresh their skills. And the answer I always get is, well, how long's a piece of string? It depends on so many different factors. But what I've found across all sectors that most people can agree on, and what I try and do is, if there isn't any guidance around restraint, I try and look to health and safety, because it is a manual handling activity. You are holding someone, often for a prolonged period of time. And if you were to do a manual handling risk assessment, you would say, identify the load, identify the individual capability, look at the task, and look at the environment that they're working in, light or sometimes called tile. Anything which is a hazardous manual handling activity, it needs risk assessing. And I think everyone agrees that a risk assessment, as a minimum, should be done annually. So that's where I keep coming back to, and I keep saying, well, if you're saying there's no level of risk, and you're like, well, we don't need to often do this stuff, which is another argument, because if you're never doing it, you'll forget it. But if you're doing it all the time, as you said, you will create your own segues and your own ways of human nature, making things easier for you. So if it's quite difficult to do a certain hold, and you find it works more quickly the way you've done it, perhaps because you're doing martial arts 7 times a week, that's what will then get embedded. Other officers, other COs will copy what you're doing, and by the time I come back to do a refresher, it's certainly not what I showed them the last time. It's sort of morphed and warped a little bit. So that issue of how often do we refresh people, often people in the ivory towers will say, oh, it's down to cost. It's down to cost. We've got really experienced guys here. You have got really experienced guys, but that's going to take the training where? It could take the training to be something completely different, a completely different animal than it was 12 months ago.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Look, we're coming up on time now, because I know you've got to get in a car and head to your next appointment. So, just to close us out, would you like to tell us a little bit about your company? About we've talked a little bit about what you do, but in terms of what services you offer and how people can get in touch if they'd like to engage you or learn more about your products.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm quite active on LinkedIn. You can find me as Doug P. Melia on LinkedIn. I've got a Facebook under the same name, Doug P. Melia. Our company's called Safer Handling, and we supply the soft restraint kit. So the trademarks of ours is the soft cuffs, the safe holding system, and the soft restraint belt, known as the soft restraint kit. You can find plenty out about us online, and I've got a YouTube channel which is Safer Handling, where, like yourself, Joe, I'm often on my soapbox talking about what matters or what I think matters from my client's perspective.
Thank you to Doug Melia for making himself available for this particular podcast. It was great to have a conversation with Doug regarding a topic that we don't spend a lot of time on, and really we should, which is the safe restraint and safe physical intervention of people that need to be controlled but don't warrant being harmed. And it's always better if we can find ways of controlling someone without harming them or causing undue stress. So if you want to know more about Doug, you can check out him on LinkedIn, Doug Melia, which is Melia, or you can go to his website, which is safer-handling.co.uk. Thanks for listening. Have a brilliant holiday season wherever you are, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Managing Violence podcast. For more information or to listen to previous episodes, please check out www.joesaunders.com.au or visit us on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Don't forget to rate and subscribe so you never miss a show.